Thank you, Ishwari. And thanks, Chintan, and thanks, Simmi, for joining us. And thanks to all the participants. A very warm welcome to you once again. And very briefly, as you all know, the Institute for Sustainable Communities is working at the intersection of the social, environmental, and economic impacts of climate change. And our work with the MSME sector is very pertinent to our core belief, and that is that no one should be left behind in this green transition. And we all would agree that MSMEs are so critical to India's economic growth, the rapidly happening economic growth, where the MSMEs make a very significant contribution. They comprise the entire supply chains of all the major economic sectors. And that's why it's so critical that we are able to decarbonize the supply chains, which is the scope 3 of all the emissions, the major emissions that are emitted by the Indian industries. Our work has primarily focused on building the capacity of the MSMEs, making sure that we are able to facilitate platforms, coalitions, networks that connect the MSMEs or the CleanTech startups with financial institutions, with investors, with the buyers from the industries. And, with that, I would like to just very briefly share a couple of comments, and then I would like to have Chintan and Simmi share their opening remarks. You would agree with me that India has made big commitments, Panchamrit, as we call them. These are fairly very high-level vision or ambitions statements that our country has made, and we are bound by these commitments. But unless we break them down, unless we look at how we will decarbonize each of the sectors, it is not going to be possible to achieve these targets. But we are fairly we are advancing very fast on the renewables. We can see a lot of climate finance flowing towards the renewables, and of late, clean mobility is getting a lot of traction. Agri is getting a lot of traction, but we see that the MSMEs are still lagging behind. The flow of climate finance is not happening at the pace and scale that it needs to happen at towards the MSMEs. We see that within the MSMEs as well, a lot of climate finance is again flowing towards the clean energy technology, be it solar or other solar-based technologies, process technologies. But for energy efficiency, again, the finance is very, very, very limited. It's fairly limited. So today, what we would like to discuss very specifically, our focus is going to be on the automobile sector, but we will focus on what are those strategic levers and how we can increase the flow of climate finance towards the MSME supply chains. That is where our focus is going to be. And so to start, I would request both Chintan and Simmi, to start with Simmi to make their opening remarks on the current landscape and the flow of climate finance towards the MSMEs. What's your perspective on that?
Thanks, Suresh. Glad to be here. So as Ishwari mentioned, my work across CleanTech and Unitas focuses on finding new innovative ways to move more capital to climate innovation and climate action in India. And what we have realized over many years of working in the space is that while many things need to come together to improve climate adoption, finance is one of the most critical elements in making adoption possible. There, as you rightly said, Suresh, large corporations have majorly solved for this finance, right? Whether they are looking at adding a solar project or adding e-vehicle fleets or any other intervention that makes them climate positive or net zero, because of their high credit ratings, because of the fact that even climate tech companies or climate solution providers are able to offer these solutions as a service to them, they are able to fund those quite easily. It remains a challenge in terms of scaling the same solutions for MSMEs. So I would say two things here to begin with. I think one, it's critical that MSMEs adopt these solutions. Whether it is renewable energy, more energy efficient processes in terms of your production facility or heating or cooling, moving your transportation needs to electric mobility, or adopting things like moving your boilers to fuel sources other than coal, to biofuels or RDF. There are many ways in which small businesses can transition to net zero or more climate positive world. And it is, especially in case of areas like automotive, where you are suppliers to a Hyundai or a large corporation globally who has net zero goals, it's going to become a requirement to supply to them to have those things in place. So one, it's essential. Two, there are now many forms of capital available to access this. I would say the challenges lie both around awareness and also awareness at the lenders or capital providers end to assess these MSMEs correctly. But increasingly, we are seeing programs getting built at places like State Bank of India, Simmi, and many others to provide capital for whatever upfront capital expenditure is required to build these projects. It's still not easy, but it's definitely been a very positive movement in the last 5 years. So I'll stop here and we can talk about specific interventions during the course of this discussion.
Thanks. And over to Chintan for your opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Suresh, and the other people over here. I think SME is a very important segment when you're looking at energy transition. And somehow I think they've been missed out. And essentially it's because of the way the lenders perceive SMEs in terms of their, essentially the way they put the governance structure, which is very different than what the bankers need. And that's, as an ex-banker, I'm telling you. And I think that's where the gap is. Most of the SMEs are good people, good sector and all, and they hardly default. But when they're looking at documentations and the papers that are needed for lending, that's not adequate. So we need to essentially think about how we can somehow mainstream those and include them in the entire energy transition. I was also doing my own research on the SME sector. I think we have something like 9 million SMEs registered with Government of India by now across states. And of which about 15% of the SMEs, they require something like 200 to 500 kilowatt of solar or wind, whatever, to go for carbon neutrality. So we have a huge market on one side. On the second side, you have an issue with SMEs that they don't have the documentation which is needed by the mainstream bankers to get the adequate finance. So if we can somehow bridge those gaps, I think we are talking about a big market on one side. And on the second side is we can also include those SMEs as a part of the transition. I think let's discuss this portion today in the webinar and see how we can solve this problem.
Share, a very quick response on if you had the power to implement a policy which would enable more climate finance to flow towards MSMEs, what would that policy be? A very brief response from both of you. And then we will also see, if there are any questions from the audience, and we will try and pose a couple of them and then try and wrap it up.
Simmi, can go first.
Sure, I can do that, Chintan. And I think I'll just pick off from where Chintan left off in the previous question, which is that MSMEs are not going to change. They exist in a certain framework, but the reality remains that because their customers would not need them to become net zero, they would have to implement these interventions. The interventions we've seen work at scale the most is where funders are incentivized to fund these projects, not MSMEs. Take an example of SBI, who got a World Bank line to fund rooftop solar. And because they had to, use that money in a certain way, or because SIDBI got money from GCF to fund MSME rooftop solar projects, they were forced to create MSME-friendly policies or easier documentation norms. So an MSME cannot go out and raise a green bond, but a State Bank of India can. And when they raise a green bond specifically for energy efficiency in MSMEs, they will have to, by necessity, create policies that MSMEs are able to access that capital. We've seen that work with limited success, but we've seen that work in rooftop solar with various interventions. I think there is possibility to make that work for biofuels and compressed biogas, for electric mobility, for energy efficiency as well. Create lenders, and they will find ways to build a pipeline of MSMEs.
Thanks, Simmi. Great comments. Chintan, your quick response there.
Yeah, Suresh, particularly what happened with the SME sector is when a lender looks at SME, it always finds it risky. The very fact remains that, most of the SMEs don't default. That's the reality. But when you look at the papers of an SME, you always have all the indication of a default. So Simmi is right, you need to incentivize the lenders. And somehow if you can create something like an FLDG framework for lenders to give credit to SMEs. Now, CGTSME is something like an FLDG cover. So essentially, you cover up the lender for providing credit to the SME, and the lenders get covered in case of a default. It's a theoretical default. SMEs don't default normally, unless the core sector is failing. They don't default. So you need to somehow come with this FLDG covers or first plus guarantee covers, where the lenders feel very, very comfortable in providing credit to the SMEs. And that's how the SMEs can be empowered in availing credit facilities. And obviously, the FLDG covers can be specified for a particular application, like energy transition, for example. That's what I would say. That's my takeaway.